So our class is going to be a little probably, let's call it 18 plus. So if you don't want your children hearing any of this, that's absolutely fine. But my sons, they're right now, I would say grown boys. So I'm sure they need to learn all that I'm talking about because they have to learn the mannerisms of adults. Okay. So let's see. We were talking last time about the ayah وَلُوطًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ مَا سَبَقَكُمْ بِهَا مِنْ أَحَدٍ مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ. And we talked about the name Lut. And we basically said that there were two different opinions between scholars. One is that the name Lut is mushtaq, meaning that it was conjugated from a certain word, and then they went into a debate which word is that, and then the majority of the scholars actually said it was not mushtaq, but it is actually a foreign name. That is, it is not an Arabic name, and therefore considered that it was Arabized in order to basically make it easy for them to understand. But then we also went to another researcher the day before, and Rauf Saada, and we looked into his book and we said how he's connecting some of the names with some parts of the story, with Ishaq to actually mean a person that is bringing laughter. And even though it's actually in Hebrew, but we could see that the ayah was indicating فضحكت, and the word ضحكت, and that she had laughed was actually mentioned twice in the Quran, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given her Ishaq. Yet versus Lut alayhi salam, we said that very many stories emphasize that Prophet Lut alayhi salam was a companion and was a supporter for Prophet Ibrahim. And we also went in certain details in regards to وَلُوطًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ. But the last class, we didn't get into all the details of the word Lut, but we more went into the details of the word al-fahisha, into the word al-fahisha, and we talked a lot about what al-fahisha means, and let's just remember some of the things that we did. So we said al-fahisha is any inappropriate behavior, whether that was an oral inappropriate behavior or whether that was in action. And we looked at the number of different scholars that basically helped us know how we are capable of defining whether something is right and wrong in behavior. But I forgot to mention one thing, which I did say before, but I guess I'll hint it this time and kind of, bring it back to your attention when we talk about the philosophy of ethics, the philosophy of morality. How do we differentiate whether something is moral or not? So certainly as a Muslim, your first key of reference is going to be Quran and Sunnah, or the first two key references is Quran and Sunnah. The third one is basically the Salihin and their actions and their inspirations. And that's why when we look at the word fahish and fuhsh, we're looking at the different things that may affect the person's ability to recognize, to be able to distinguish between right and wrong. So therefore, we would go for at-tab' salim. We would go for a person that basically had been raised, disciplined by righteousness, and they would have better capabilities in sensing ethics and morality than others. Why? Because the other people that got normalized with all the misbehavior, they would end up basically absorbing it, and it becomes a norm. It becomes something that contaminates their mind, contaminates their heart, and certainly will affect their behavior as well. So when we say we're speaking about some resources, we're also looking at people that had the discipline of akhlaq, the discipline of Islam, the discipline of religious integrity, taqwa, etc. And certainly the aql, the mind that basically grew up in recognizing and distinguishing haqq from batil. There is one thing that I did forget to mention last time, which I had mentioned before, but the probability of having somebody, let's say, grew up maybe back home or grew up in a Muslim country, grew up in a Muslim society, and let me use a different word, not influenced by a lot of the modern influences, whether we're speaking about postmodernism or feminism or atheism or scientism or all of that. And you're seeing that they're living far away from all of that, far away, perhaps maybe in a country, far away, or maybe away from modernity. Those people usually have better akhlaq and better foundation. I'm talking about Muslim countries here. They usually have less influences and contaminants that affected their minds, affected their religious integrity, affected their principles, and certainly affected their vision. So those people would usually be considered or usually have better akhlaq, better طبع, or better, let's call it habits, and usually are less contaminated by all the different influences that may have come, whether we're speaking about during our modern times, come from perhaps liberalism or maybe atheism or feminism or, just different postmodern things without us realizing there is an agenda. So usually those types of agendas can be infiltrating the system, whether we're speaking about media, we're speaking about schools, we're speaking about, hey, phones, we're speaking about social media, we're speaking about different things that we would see in the society. That's why even when it comes to foods, you will see people that are living away from the city are usually healthier, got better teeth, better gums, better body, less cancer, less diabetes problems, and the list goes on and on. And you would see that they're actually living a better health style, better lifestyle, and certainly we're not just talking about health-wise, but we're also talking about less contamination as as basically they get less of that influence that's coming from all this liberal world that is right now infiltrating all systems. So they're not infiltrated by the system, they're actually completely far away, and certainly that they're not influenced by it. Okay, let's see. And we said in general, the word fahisha usually is referring to zina, adultery, or fornication. Yet the only ayah that is not referring to zina when it talked about al-fahsha is basically this ayah right there, because it was talking about not giving zakah. We went in details with the differences in the words of what al-mutafahish is and what al-tafahush is, and certainly al-mutafahish is a person that induces such a behavior, or probably is okay, had normalized such a wrong behavior that it became to them as a norm, or probably the first behavior that they would act in. Whenever they're given these empty spaces with no supervision, the first thing that they're willing to do is behave in such a behavior, such a wrong behavior, where they're speaking the wrong way, or probably, let's call it flirting with others in that way, etc. So that would be al-mutafahish whenever there's no supervision, whenever there's no authority to stop them, that's when they engage in such behavior. It-tafahush, on the other hand, would actually be the behavior itself, where you're seeing two parties perhaps exchanging this behavior, whether we're speaking about an oral behavior, everybody is saying this type of word, that type of foul language, and the list goes on, and then the whole society is basically engaging in this type of behavior, thinking of it and normalizing it as it's being cool, as it's acceptable, as the only only an adult person would do, and it's appropriate for an adult person to do it, but not a younger person, but certainly not in the lens of Islam. When you become an adult, you should become a person of better akhlaq. Not when you become an adult, you get to say what younger children were told that a disciplined person would not say. So we don't live in this type of discrepancy and this type of self-contradiction, believing that only adults can say such words or only adults can behave in this way, but not children. So we would say, well, in Islam, in fact, when you become an adult, you should then, and by then, should have already mastered the best of the akhlaq. So by then you should have already mastered the best of akhlaq. So therefore, we should assume better akhlaq and better expectations from you. So we also looked at what al-Ghazali had said. And Ghazali basically had considered that the reason for the prohibition of such foul language or such illicit behavior / al-fuhsh is because of the impact it has on people's hearts, because of the impact it has on people's hearts, because of the impact it has on people's minds, and therefore affecting their ability to recognize truth, affecting their ability to live in truth in two different areas. We're speaking about what we already had said, هداية التوفيق and هداية الإرشاد. So in order for you to be able to consume, to process, to absorb هداية الإرشاد, which is basically Al-Quran, which is the information that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent in revelation, in order for you to be able to absorb all of that, to process it, to be able to focus on it, you would definitely have to learn how to discipline yourself from letting your whims or letting your behavior get carried away with the wrong behavior, and certainly contaminating your hidayat al-tawfiq. So we're looking at two areas, hidayat al-tawfiq and hidayat al-irshad, the hidayah or the guidance of revelation or information or aqidah, and the guidance of action, آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات. Think of it as آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات. آمنوا would be هداية الإرشاد, عملوا الصالحات would be هداية التوفيق, and certainly this side affects that side. So we cannot assume that if a person's behavior is probably going wrong, that somehow it does not affect their ability to have Iman. In fact, a person's wrong behavior may certainly get into the level of contamination. Think of it as metastasizing to affecting the person's brain, to affecting the person's heart, to affecting the person's soul, and without them realizing, they would be perhaps maybe on the threshold of even losing their iman. And we went in details with al-khabithatu lil-khabithin wal-khabithuna lil-khabithat, and we went in details with that one in Surah An-Nur, and we looked at the importance and the role of a masjid, the role of socializing and associating with the salihin, in helping you basically have this pure heart, this pure behavior, and certainly growing with your akhlaq, growing with your deen in order to affect your iman. And certainly these people are found in the masajid, these people are connected with the Quran, connected with the salah. So we basically just went in details with that one. And we left off at this one. Let's look at what we left off at. We said point number 2, which is this one. أتأتون الفاحشة, and what that means was actually talking about Prophet Lut alayhi salam scolding his own people because of the misbehavior, because of the wrong behavior that they were basically committing, and which was basically gayism. And we also commented on the word ما سبقكم بها من أحد من العالمين, and we said that is it necessarily true that there was no other nation, no other group of people, no individual to commit such a crime? And we said not necessarily as such. because ما سبقكم بها من أحد من العالمين, it can be exclusive to meaning which alam. It can be during that time. So we're speaking about during that time, that during that time in history, there it might have been true that there were no other group of people that were behaving in such a wrong aberration, in such a wrong behavior. So therefore, what is the behavior? So that would be one piece of it. That was one interpretation. And we also went into which book? Where was it? I think it was this book. This was the book that we went to in order to help us, I guess, refute this misconception. So we went into this book, and certainly we had, alhamdulillah, the privilege to actually get to knowing at least this misconception and what it carries. The other rebuttal against this misconception is that Prophet Lut alayhi salam was not only scolding them for one type of behavior, but he was scolding them for multiple types of behaviors, and that included that they were making it a public behavior, that they were basically normalizing it as if it was right, not feeling guilty about it. And number three, that they were also adding on to that as shirk. But certainly that is not to mean that such a behavior is permissible, but this is to basically expose the wrong behavior. Why does the Quran even speak about such a wrong behavior? I mean, there are going to be innocent kids reading Quran. Why would you expose such a thing? Why introduce such a thing? Okay, now, when the Quran speaks about even Qawm Lut, you could see that there were no explicit type of, let's call it graphic description. There were no graphic description, but it was basically giving us certain details that was not graphic, but that was in order to let us know that mannerisms are not understood only by describing and explaining what's a good manner. In order to learn what the different details of mannerisms, you certainly also need to learn that area of the wrong manner in order to be able to distinguish it from the right manner. So we're looking at wrong manner in order to be able to distinguish it from the right manner. You basically have to know both. So what does that look like? In order for you to know what Iman is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduces or at least exposes kufr to us. Same thing. In order for you to know what akhlaq are, you have to know what mis-akhlaq are. You have to know both sides, because there's no way to just talk about what good is out there or what's good to do, but you also have to know what to avoid. Just like Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman. Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman would always ask about the wrong akhlaq in order to learn what to avoid, because if I know the parameters of what is wrong, then therefore I would know the parameter of what is right and what is considered as appropriate. So let's look at this ayah right there. القرطبي said that اختلف العلماء فيما يجب على من فعل ذلك بعد إجماعهم على تحريمه. This is a very important sentence. What does it mean anyways? He said scholars actually had differences of opinions on what happens. In other words, what is the consequence? What is the punishment for a person that had committed such a crime? Now, they disputed what the punishment looks like, but they had unanimously agreed that that was considered as a crime. They had agreed unanimously that it was haram. There was not any form or any dispute or any differences of opinions that gayism or same-sex engagement, whether from females or males, is that it is haram, as unanimously agreed between scholars. The new the new people that started rising without naming names, that did not have ilm and were actually misinterpreting the ayat and saying that this is basically saying that what is haram is rape and not engaging in gay or same-sex relations, is misinterpreting or even selecting certain ayat out of context and then coming to introduce a new interpretation that was not whatsoever coming with the context and certainly with what the ayat are saying. For the ayat are explicitly clear right there. إنكم لتأتون الرجال شهوة. To approach a man in lust basically means right there, من دون النساء. This is to let us know that this was a behavior that Islam, that the Quran was exposing as something that was disgusting, as something that is an aberration, as something that is an illicit behavior, and therefore something that is prohibited. Let me stop for a second. Many times, you would get people coming to tell you, well, I want an evidence to prove to me, for example, that this same-sex relations is haram, and they're looking for the word haram. Now, what they may not understand is that, because of course they probably didn't take usul al-fiqh, is that in order to regard something as haram, it does not necessarily have to use the word haram, but it can use different meanings and different wordings in order to give me the same conclusion, which is that this type of behavior is not accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as something that is a good behavior, and therefore certain methods to tell me that something is haram may be in one, just like this sentence, إنكم لتأتون الرجال شهوة من دون النساء. What was it called? It was called al-fahisha. Al-fahisha is supposed to basically mean an aberration, a behavior that is not acceptable. What does that look like? So here, Prophet Lut alayhi salam is exposing it furthermore and saying that no one had ever come with such a behavior. When you use such a hyperbole, but keeping in mind that hyperbole in Lugha Arabiya is not as in English to mean that it's an exaggeration, but in Lugha Arabiya, an exaggerated word is not necessarily to mean that it is reflecting something that is beyond the reality. But sometimes in Lugha Arabiya, when we say ما سبقكم بها من أحد من العالمين, that is certainly a hyperbole, but that is to basically show the severity of such a behavior, the severity of such a transgression, the severity of such an illicit aberration, and therefore it would continue. In order for us not to confuse what fahisha are we talking about? Are we speaking about rape? Are we speaking about perhaps killing other people? Or perhaps maybe not donating, etc. So then it goes and says right there, I'm going to put a semicolon. What does that look like? إنكم لتأتون الرجال شهوة من دون النساء. You're approaching men in ways that it involves shahwa. When we say shahwa, we're speaking about lust. We're specifically speaking about sexual desire being involved right in this type of behavior. So whether we're speaking about touching, whether we're speaking about penetration, or any form of an aberration that involves men, same sex, or certainly outside of marriage, is basically considered haram. Let me just stop at this one for a second, and we're going to go to a very important ayah, or actually two important ayat. Let's just remember our page 169 right there, and actually go to Surah Al-Mu'minun. Let's go to Surah Al-Mu'minun. And in Surah Al-Mu'minun, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets us know, let's see right there, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ إِلَّا عَلَى أَزْوَاجِهِمْ أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُمْ فَإِنَّهُمْ غَيْرُ مَلُومِينَ فَمَنِ ابْتَغَى وَرَاءَ ذَلِكَ فَأُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْعَادُونَ. What does that mean? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically praised the believers, and he basically talks about their prayer, etc. But then when he talked about something very important, he said, and those that would guard their private parts. When you talk about the private part, whether we're speaking about the front or whether we're speaking about the back. So I'm sure everybody knows the human anatomy, no need to be explicit further. So in that situation, we're speaking about, okay, how do we guard our private parts? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes only one exception or two exceptions. That is, إِلَّا عَلَى أَزْوَاجِهِمْ أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُم. The only two people that is permissible to expose the private part or to expose and engage in such a lustful act is basically only with the spouse in a legal halal marriage relationship or with the concubines. That is not any maid, but this is actually talking about when slavery was there. Okay, فَإِنَّهُمْ غَيْرُ مَلُومِينَ. That is the only time when they would not be held accountable. When you say غَيْرُ مَلُومِينَ, you're speaking about that they're not held accountable. They're not going to be blamed for it. Therefore, they do not have to feel guilty because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created that to be as something acceptable in nature, and it is only within the relationship in marriage only. فَمَنِ ابْتَغَى وَرَاءَ ذَلِكَ فَأُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْعَادُونَ. And those, whoever basically would go beyond that. What is that referring to? Beyond that limit, which is that it is exclusive to be within a halal marriage relationship, period. Therefore, anybody that goes beyond such a limit, فَأُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْعَادُونَ, those would be the people that are considered as transgressors. When you say a transgressor, what are you looking at? We're looking at another word that is giving me a definition of simply meaning haram. Simply meaning haram. So therefore, we come to the first meaning of what defines haram. It can be regarding something as mu'tadi, as somebody that had committed a transgression, somebody that had committed an assault, somebody that had committed a crime. Another ayah that basically is relating to this as well is basically in Surah Al-Ma'arij. Let's go to Surah Al-Ma'arij really quick because it involves the same basically the same meaning and the same understanding. So let's go for Surah Al-Ma'arij. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there basically said, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ. Same idea. Those that would guard their private parts. إِلَّا عَلَى أَزْوَاجِهِمْ أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُمْ فَإِنَّهُمْ غَيْرُ مَلُومِينَ. Basically, except their spouses and certainly their concubines, those would be the only two that they would basically not be considered guilty or committing anything that holds them accountable. فَمَنِ ابْتَغَى وَرَاءَ ذَلِكَ فَأُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْعَادُونَ. With the same exact concept, it came, whoever goes beyond that limit, then they would be the ones that had committed an aberration, committed basically a behavior that they will be considered as committing a transgression, and therefore they'll be accountable for it. The other method of knowing whether something is haram or not is letting us know that something is basically we're supposed to be distant from. So just like when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically talked about zina, for example, and said, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا إِنَّهُ كَانَ فَاحِشًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا, to tell us not to get near it. That's another way for knowing that something is not acceptable is basically by using the word لا تقربوا, do not approach. Therefore, keep distance. That's to let us know that it's giving me the inference that this is something that is detested, something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered it as a limit, and therefore not something permissible to approach. Another word to use is as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had talked about al-khamr, basically talked about al-khamr, that it is something that one is supposed to basically leave, and use the word فَهَلْ أَنْتُمْ مُنْتَهُونَ, are you leaving this entirely? In other words, also giving me the inference that this is not acceptable. The fifth method of knowing that something is haram is to know that something is punishable. That whether we're speaking about a group of people, just like when we're speaking about Qawm Lut, that they were basically punished, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, فَأَنْجَيْنَاهُ وَأَهْلَهُ إِلَّا امْرَأَتَهُ كَانَتْ مِنَ الْغَابِرِينَ وَأَمْطَرْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ مَطَرًا. This is to let us know that this is a punishable behavior, therefore not an acceptable behavior, therefore, and the inference is haram. But many people may not understand لغة عربية, or may not understand the usul al-fiqh as well, and might confuse and think, well, I need the word haram. Same thing if we're looking at what makes something as obligatory. They will say, well, I need something to tell me that this is fard. I will say, well, you're looking for the wrong word, because just as haram does not, if something is haram, does not necessarily have to use the word haram, but it can give me the inference to let me know that this behavior is not acceptable, or something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rejects and considers as something that is a crime. Same thing, we will say that if something is giving me an imperative verb and letting me know وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ, that if therefore it's giving me an order, it's giving me a command, it's giving me an imperative verb, then in that situation I would know that the inference is that this is something that I have to abide by, I have to obey. So I don't want to get into usul al-fiqh right now, but just to understand, when you look at this wording right here, بعد إجماعهم على تحريمه, that scholars had unanimously agreed that this behavior is completely haram and is in fact a major sin. This is not a minor sin, but this is a major sin. What's the difference between a major sin and a minor sin? A major sin, we would see whether an ayah or a hadith basically letting me know that this is something that is punishable either in this dunya by the government, or punishable by the government, that is the Muslim government, or punishable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Judgment Day, or in dunya. So if I have any behavior that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had foretold me that this is not acceptable and it is punishable, or something that is cursed slash mal'oon, or something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will consider them as mu'tadi, that's how we, mu'tadi to mean committing a crime, that's how we would know that this would be considered as a major sin. A minor sin would be a little less in the way that we would define it, because a minor sin, and there's also something even smaller than minor sin, which is il-lamam. Il-lamam would not necessarily be something that is permissible, or at least the minor sins would be something that is haram, but we do not have a text that gave me a specific punishment for it. And therefore, we would see certain texts telling me that it is not appropriate to do this. A Muslim would not engage such an act. This is not right. This is not acceptable. A Muslim would, and the list goes on and on. Now, scholars, based on these two simple way of distinguishing minor sin and major sin. They actually had differences of opinions on whether major sin is exclusive to the seven major sins or سبع الموبقات, or whether the major sins are a lot more than just the seven major sins mentioned in the hadith, which is the preponderant interpretation. Why? Because we would say that the seven major sins that were mentioned in the hadith, they were basically speaking about the most important ones, but that is not to say that this is exclusive to these seven major sins, and therefore other behaviors are not included in it. But the major sins may sometimes be outside of the seven major sins, السبع الموبقات, and can include other behaviors as well. And part of these major sins is basically same-sex relations, and that's why the scholars actually went, because they agreed unanimously that it is haram. The scholars had differences of opinions, not on the ruling of it, but on the punishment and what it looks like. The first opinion, I'm going to go really quick over these because we need to understand criminal law and what it looks like. In Islam, when we speak about criminal law, or basically the different punishments of different crimes, we're looking at different types of punishments. The first one is al-hudud. What does that mean? The word hudud, from the name, from the definition, actually means a certain limit. So meaning that there is a certain punishment, that there is a certain an assigned limit to a specific behavior, and therefore we cannot use such an assigned punishment to do qiyas, or to do an analogy and actually punish other behaviors, or even perhaps use that particular punishment and apply it on another behavior. That's the first one, al-hudud. The second one is basically al-qasas. What is al-qasas? Al-qasas basically involves, usually we're speaking about killing, the crime of killing. It involves not necessarily a specific punishment where it's limited, but it has different options. So for example, if somebody killed somebody, we're speaking about the option of one, probably paying a fine, which is equivalent to almost $300,000 as the compensation for the crime that they had committed, or to probably the family would have the right to say, well, no, I don't want a fine. No money is going to compensate me for the death of our own child, or death of our loved one, or the killing of our loved one, but we actually want the criminal or the person, the perpetrator, to basically get killed instead. The third option is to then discuss whether this was an attempted first-degree murder, or whether it was a second degree, or what we're looking at. Then in that situation, the details of what the blood money, then we'll discuss later. We're not going to discuss it here, but just to let us know. Now, the third type of punishment that would be called ta'zir. Let me write those really, really quick. Oh, the problem is my raw is not working. So I'll just write it in English. Okay, let's see. So the first one is called had. The second one is basically called qisas. And the third one is ta'zir. Let me explain ta'zir for a bit. Ta'zir is when that is an aberration, that is a crime, a transgression, but I don't have any specific numbering or any specific assigned punishment for this behavior. And or I don't have any punishment that basically leaves it that someone is supposed to probably pay a fine, or etc. So in that situation, the word ta'zir, it's a punishment, but this punishment is basically left for the qadi or for the government to assign what area and what this punishment looks like, and certainly the degree severity of what this punishment should basically get up to. So scholars then, for ta'zir, they also went into differences of opinions on each one of these types of punishments. So we're looking at, for example, imprisonment. Can we use imprisonment as a method for punishment? Paying a fine, community service. Can we use either? Can we get up to corporal punishment as well? What does that look like? All of these different areas, they can go up to 14 different types of punishment, and then the scholars actually had differences of opinions on each and every single one of them, and some basically went in certain details, and I don't want to get into all the details, but at least know that ta'zir is left for the government, for the judge to basically use as to assign, and it can be based on al-maslaha, based on the benefit, based on what perhaps maybe at the time the judge may see a certain behavior, we need to discipline the people and we need to use a form of discipline. It can be imprisonment, it can be a fine, it can be perhaps maybe community service, it can be maybe of giving them other types of punishment to discipline within the society. That is left, that is ta'zir. It is not assigned, and its details were not clarified, but this is left for the judges, the government, to basically use as a way to discipline the society and correct their behavior. Is it for major sin or a minor sin? It can be for a major sin and it can be for a minor sin, but certainly, the scholars disputed whether it can go up until the severity of perhaps a had. Can it reach the level of stoning as had? Can this behavior that was basically a crime committed, can we do ta'zir to go up to the level of execution? That's when they also dispute in that. So that's that area of dispute. Just keep it in mind. And that's why scholars actually had differences of opinions on whether that same-sex type of behavior, whether it is to be treated as a had, basically as compared to zina, meaning fornication or adultery, or whether this falls within ta'zir. If we say that this is a had, then according to the Maliki opinion, they said we're going to treat it exactly the way that we would treat fornication or adultery. And in fornication or adultery, that means a person had a marriage experience before, then in that situation, they would basically be stoned for committing zina. If this person did not have a marriage experience before, therefore this person is a virgin, male or female, didn't have a marriage experience before, regardless of them being divorced or not, then this person would basically be flogged for 100 lashes. But the lashes are not supposed to be killing lashes, so they would basically have a specific tool that is not a wooden stick, but is more of a material that is not puncturing the body and certainly not breaking bones, but it would be a tool that, and even the person that is flogging is not supposed to be raising their hands, so it's going to be basically lowered down to make sure that we are more of disciplining the person and not necessarily wanting to kill them. But if they do get killed, well, and it was basically done based on what was directed as in the punishment of al-had, then in that situation, this is not to be taken from the person that applied the punishment, because this person is basically a government official. This is a government official basically applying what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered as وَلَا تَأْخُذْكُمْ بِهِمَا رَأْفَةٌ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, do not feel any mercy upon them, because there are certain punishments. There are certain punishments that basically need to be applied, because their area of feeling the mercy, of feeling the affection, should be directed at the society itself and protecting them, and protecting basically these children from that may result as a result of such a behavior, and certainly maybe the result of having children outside of wedlock, and children fatherless, and children basically not having the parents around, etc. So we basically would consider that our ra'fa, our affection, our care, our mercy is basically looking at these children. If they were to be basically the product of such a behavior, what would happen? What their life would look like because of two adults that got carried away with their own lust. So Islam basically focuses on making sure that, one, whether we're speaking about the preservation of deen, or whether we're speaking about the preservation of ird. Remember this. So why is same-sex necessarily considered as haram? Why is it haram? Why can't we just consider that these are two consenting people? They consented, then therefore their consent should be something that we should just give them the space. Since they consented, we should just give them the space to decide whether they want to behave in that way or not. Islam does not regard that your consent as a human being, that it goes beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's consent. That's what Islam is all about. Islam is all about that you submit your consent to the consent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what it means to be Muslim. To be Muslim basically means that you submit your actions, you submit your will, you submit yourself, you submit your consent to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had approved. That is what it means to be Muslim. It means to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that way. Therefore, when we understand this piece of it, we understand that the parameters of what it means to be Muslim is to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in deen. Let's use the word D-N-A-I-M again right there, D-N-A-I-M. And we said it is to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Maybe we can make it bigger, right? Hopefully I can get some space right there. Let me see if I can. Okay, it's only allowing me to stay within this perimeter. Okay, let's go like this. I'm going to do D-N-A-I-M, even though I explained it before, but this is my favorite acronym, so we're going to use that, inshallah. So the parameters are basically, number one is D to stand for deen, N for nafs, A for aql, and I for ird, and M for mal. So when we're looking at this acronym, we're speaking about preserving deen is basically the first important priority. Preserving deen to meaning tawheed, to meaning the person's relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number two, preserving nafs. Therefore, the human life sanctity is basically the second most important area that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered as needing to be dealt with complete sanctity, and regarded as the highest level of holiness, or the highest level of, let's call it, the border and the perimeter, which is human life. And therefore, whether killing your own life, inflicting pain probably on your body, or whether this is talking about inflicting pain on other people's bodies, or probably killing somebody, that would be considered as a major sin. A for aql. So if we're seeing somebody, whether we're speaking about inducing intoxication, whether through drugs or whether through alcohol, or whether through other substances, or whether we're speaking about maybe getting into manipulation, shubuhat, etc. Anything that malfunctions the brain's activity or malfunctions its ability to understand or even process the right education, that would be considered as an aberration against mind, against the third most important parameter that Islam had regarded that deserves key sanctity. Number three, or number four, is ird. Ird basically involves sexual relations. It involves family. So if we're talking about each and every single one of these, this involves one, we're speaking about social stability. This is talking about mental stability, and this is talking about social stability. Number two, we're speaking about right there the preservation of family. Why was zina haram from the first place? Zina was haram basically because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He had created nature to continue in reproduction in a certain structure. Going against the structure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically considered as an aberration, and going against the structure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually considered ruining the structure that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered and had created at its finest, at its best, at its level of stability to bring about the maximized benefit. Let me focus on the word maximize benefit, because many times we would see people coming in and saying, well, I mean, it makes me happy. Why do you consider it haram? Is Islam against people's happiness? We'll say, wait a minute. You have to understand that the definition of akhlaq in Islam is not necessarily focused on maximizing entertainment or maximizing lust or maximizing dopamine, but is actually focused on maximizing benefit, maximizing interest to lead to stability and to lead to peace. This is the most important thing, is understanding that Islam is basically focused on maximizing benefit, maximizing stability, maximizing justice, maximizing what brings the highest level of stability for you, and not necessarily maximizing that ecstasy or maximizing this happiness, or maximizing the dopamine, or maximizing the lust, or whatever you want to say, but is actually focused on maximizing benefit, stability, justice. And certainly when you look at ird, why is zina haram? It's in order to protect especially the vulnerable, the children that may basically be the product of such a relationship. Islam comes in to protect them since they are vulnerable. Islam comes in to protect their rights when the society or these adults are probably consenting. They did not basically have their consent to be beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's consent. That's number one. Number two, consenting adults is not to be treated as if it is the new center or the God that we would basically define whether something is acceptable or not. Think of it as this: just when you see a red light, just because you consented, that you made the consent, I'm okay with me passing a red light, and even if it involves me making a car crash, hey, I've got auto insurance, I'm okay with that. You consenting, the government is not going to look at your consent and say, well, since you consented, we're okay with that, we're just going to let you pass, but we'll still give you a ticket for crossing a red light. Why? Because the probability of people crossing a red light when there's that specific structure, that it may lead to a car accident, and the severity of a car accident may cost somebody their life and may cost somebody their health, and etc., and probably damage to the property. We're not going to look at your consent as our reference for us to consider whether something is acceptable or not, but we're going to look at the probability. We're going to look at the the trajectory of this, the consequence of this, if it were to bring somebody's life, or if it were to affect somebody's health, etc., and what that might look like. And we know with zina, with the STDs and what that looks like, and certainly when we're speaking about same sex, it's the same thing. It is an aberration against the structure that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in nature. It is an aberration against the structure that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in the social dynamic. It is an aberration against one's deen. It is basically not putting such a potential in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted it to belong in order to bring about reproduction and so forth. Now, the final one is M, standing for mal, meaning finance, meaning money, meaning property, wealth, all of that, how it's coming in, and certainly where it's going. So an aberration against somebody's mal is going to mean stealing, scamming, etc. Then in that situation, certainly when you look at criminal law and criminal punishment, basically, you're looking at if somebody is to leave Islam, then it's basically the punishment is going to be their own life. If somebody harms somebody else's life, and then in that situation, it's going to be al-ainu bil-ain was-sinnu bis-sin. If somebody is to attack somebody's tooth, well, then we're going to basically attack them with that tooth. If it's an eye for an eye. If it's somebody's life, then we're going to basically attack their life as well. And certainly as a punishment in order to make it a fair and a just one. Yet scholars, just a note, had differences of opinions on whether al-ird comes first as a priority or whether al-aql comes first. I personally am pro al-ird coming first. And certainly because when you look at the severity of punishment for whether we're speaking about zina or fornication or adultery, we're looking at the severity. If somebody is or had a marriage experience before, then it would be stoning till death. If somebody did not have a marriage experience before, it would be 100 flogs. So if we're to compare that with if somebody were to be, let's say, a person that drinks and an alcoholic, that differences of opinions, whether it's 40 flogs or whether it's 80 flogs. So that gives us a hint, an inference to know when we're speaking about the severe the punishment or the aberration, the severe the aberration, the severe the punishment. And certainly when you're looking at mal, for example, somebody stealing someone's wealth, etc., then that would be amputating the hand. Okay, so this basically just gives us an idea why do we actually have criminal law and criminal punishment and all of that. Well, that's because when we're speaking about justice, we're speaking about the preservation of deen, nafs, aql, ird, mal, just that DNAIM that we just did just a minute ago. Okay, now the other part, of course, let's look at the scholars' opinions right there. So the scholars had differences of opinions. Imam Malik, and certainly, of course, why did al-Qurtubi speak about Malik first? He spoke about Malik and wanted to speak about Malik first because Imam Malik is considered as the madhab that al-Qurtubi embraces. It's the Maliki madhab. Let's see, what did he say? He said, well, number one opinion, there are differences of opinions. The first opinion is that Imam Malik and the Maliki madhab treat the punishment for same-sex relations the same way that zina or fornication is treated, and they consider the punishment as the same. So what is the punishment? He said, well, if the person, well, at least not completely like the same way, but he considered that whether the person had been married or not married before, this is ahsana aw lam yuhsan. So what does that mean? Imam Malik considered whether the person had a marriage relationship before, a marital experience, was in a marriage contract that is a complete in a, let's call it a Sahih marriage contract, then in that situation, whether they did have a marriage really experience before or whether they didn't, he said the punishment is going to simply be the same. That's Imam Malik. Why would he say that? We're going to see that in just a bit. What is the punishment? He said stoning. Just stop for a second. I would like to say one thing is that corporal punishment. I know during our times they would introduce it as corporal punishment, as this is something that is against human rights and etc. You want to remember one thing is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that defines human rights. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that defines whether we're speaking about principle or whether we're speaking about the punishment. Islam was always and certainly considered the sanctity of human life is as equal as killing all humanity. But also considered that the severity of such an action, if it were to be a behavior, as Kant would call it, a universal imperative, if people were to practice it as a universal action, as something that everyone is practicing, which is exactly before Trump, before the Trump era, we had this type of LGBTQIA going viral, going like it was imposed, basically, shoved down our throats, whether in the US or even around the world. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets us know the parameters. It's basically based on what he considered. The other note to mention is that stoning was not something that Islam introduced, but is actually in even the Bible, in Leviticus, in basically the Old Testament. It introduced stoning for 18 different aberrations, 18 different crimes. In Islam, it is only for 2 crimes. Compare the two. So just when the Judeo-Christian society, when they abandoned basically the Lord's commandment, well, that's their problem. We don't have to certainly fall, losing our confidence in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's commandments because we are seeing the pro-Epstein people, and the Epstein people are basically introducing their aberrations to make it something that becomes normalized and certainly something that they want to get away with. And we know that we have over 30 million women lost in sex trafficking. Where are they? Who's in charge? Who's gonna get held accountable? Well, certainly we know that no one's gonna get right now punished for their aberration and punished for their crimes, because certainly right now the people that are in charge of the system are right now the ones to determine what the system looks like. When certainly that Epstein's girlfriend was the spokesperson on behalf of women's rights in the UN, well, that says enough. We don't need to say more. Okay, so don't be losing that confidence and thinking of it in that situation when you would hear all those amplified pro-Epstein and certainly amplified liberal type of mindset coming to make us somehow doubt our Islam. Let's see. And whether this person, and this one's quite strange as well. This one is, I don't know if we're going to see down the road, different scholars actually not pro at least this piece of opinion. Let's see. For Imam Malik, that the stoning is also to be applied upon the person that it is done to, and whether we're speaking about the perpetrator or whether we're speaking about the one that it is done to. We're not here talking about coerced. Keep that one in mind. We're not talking about coerced actions, but we're actually talking about involving consensual actions. If somebody was coerced into such an action, they're not held accountable. What does it mean to be coerced in an action? When you are threatened that you would be killed, when your life is put at risk, when your health is put at risk, when your wealth is put at risk, and when we're speaking about the person that is now, that is going to be perhaps having the ability to inflict and certainly do what they are threatening to do to you, but certainly you have to, if we're speaking about somebody that it is done to them, you have to put all your effort to protect yourself, whether you're complaining to an adult or you're complaining to the government or you're complaining to who is capable of uplifting such an aberration. So to say, oh, this classmate, they basically had told me that if I don't accept their aberration, that somehow they're going to tell on me that one day I played this game and I didn't tell that they're going to tell on me, etc. That's not an acceptable reason, because we're speaking about something that is a major crime, that is a major sin right there. So if a person did not reach the age of puberty, according to Imam Malik, they would still be punished by stoning. But is that something that all scholars would agree on? No, it is not, at least this portion of it. Now, it is right now 11:26. Now, you could say that this topic is a lot of details and we need a whole class just to finish just this portion of number 2. So what I'm going to do is basically pause it right there. And we're going to be, hopefully, I think my expectations is that we might actually take more than one class. But let me give you really fast numbering, and then we'll end it right there. So that was Imam Malik. Let's see opinion number 2. Opinion number 2 basically says that this is ta'zir. What does it mean, ta'zir? Ta'zir basically means exactly how we did that classification of had, qisas, and ta'zir. Ta'zir meaning that it is the qadi, the judge, that basically assigns the punishment. And therefore, we're looking at exactly for, like the opinion of a Shafi'i, he said it is exactly like zina, meaning if it is a person that is with a marriage experience, therefore they would be stoned. If this person does not have a marriage experience, then in that situation, they would basically be flogged. And certainly in zina, in order to consider basically the transgression or the punishment, or at least punish a crime that is punishable, then we would have to consider a couple things. Number one, that the person is sane with aql, their ability to understand and their ability to know how to get out of this, the ability to understand that this is haram, the ability to understand the crime and that it's haram, etc. And number two, so we're talking about sanity, aql. Number two, we're speaking about reach the age of puberty. So when we're speaking about reach the age of puberty, we're talking about boys that reach the age of what is called a wet dream. In other words, their body, their reproductive system basically had reached the 5th stage of their development. So whether it's a male or a female. And number 3 condition is that this person, if they did not reach the age of puberty, then they're not considered as accountable. In other words, they would not be punished because they would be considered children. Okay. Was it 3? Did I say we said al-aql al-bulugh? And no, number 3 is basically to do it with consent. So if somebody was coerced, let's say raped, then in that situation, they would not be punished because they were basically not consenting to this. And therefore, all of that media that's telling us that these women were basically raped and that that Islam says, oh, they're still going to be flogged, etc. That's not actually true. That is not true. If somebody is coerced into an action, they will not be held accountable, period. Okay, let's see the other opinion. Let's see right there. Did I actually? No. So those were the main two opinions. There are other opinions, like, for example, other actions. Are they to be burnt or thrown from a high place? Even though we're going to see down the road that there's really no evidence on any of those opinions, but there are more inspirations than evidence. But I'm going to lay it out despite. I'm going to lay them out despite those so that we would basically cover everything that was mentioned in Tafsir al-Qurtubi. So I'm going to lay out the different methods of ta'zir that different Sahaba or even different Khulafa used. But just to note, there is no authentic hadith in giving us an explicit and a detailed method of what this punishment looks like. All attempts to assign and to give details of what the punishment looks like, really, there's no evidence whatsoever to be a direct and exact evidence, direct and specific evidence, to actually give me a detailed punishment in what it looks like, but I'm still going to mention them, even though all of those hadith we're going to see down the road that they're actually not authentic. But that doesn't mean we're going to reject it entirely. We're going to see these hadith, inshallah, and we're going to scrutinize these opinions, inshallah, tomorrow. Okay, so stay tuned for tomorrow. If there are any questions for now, I'd be happy to listen to them, or even comments. I'd be happy to listen to it. So go ahead.